100-foot cliffs, machine gun fire raining from above. 225 Rangers started climbing. Only 90 would walk away. June 6, 1944. While thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, a small group of American Rangers prepared to attempt something that military planners called suicide. They would scale vertical cliffs under enemy fire, capture a fortified German position at the top, and hold it against counterattacks. The mission was so dangerous that planners estimated 70% casualties in the first 10 minutes. They were right about the casualties, wrong about the outcome. This is not a story about one hero. This is the story of 225 men who volunteered for a mission they knew would probably kill them. Tank crews can take cover behind armor. Paratroopers can disperse after landing. But these men would climb exposed rock faces, while German soldiers shot down at them from prepared positions. There would be no cover, no concealment, just rope, rock, and whatever courage they could find. The target was Pointe du Hoc, a cliff-top promontory jutting into the English Channel between Utah and Omaha beaches. German intelligence had positioned 6 155mm guns in fortified concrete bunkers at the top. These guns had a range of 15 miles. They could hit ships offshore. They could obliterate landing beaches. They could destroy the entire invasion before it began. Allied command decided those guns had to be silenced in the first hours of D-Day. Someone had to climb those cliffs and take them out. The job went to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder. Rudder was 34 years old, a former football coach from Texas. He did not look like a Hollywood commando. He looked like a high school teacher, which he had been. But he had a quality that mattered more than appearance. His men trusted him completely. When he said the mission could be done, they believed him. When he said he would climb those cliffs with them, they knew he meant it. Planning for the Pointe du Hoc assault began months before D-Day. British commandos provided cliff-scaling training. Special equipment was designed: rope ladders, grappling hooks fired from rockets, extension ladders borrowed from London Fire Brigade, and mounted on landing craft. Every ranger practiced until they could climb in their sleep. But training on English cliffs is not the same as climbing under fire. Training assumes the enemy will wait politely while you ascend. Training does not include machine guns. Training does not include grenades rolling down from above. Training does not include watching the man next to you fall 80 feet under rocks. The Rangers knew this. They trained anyway. Each man carried 60 pounds of equipment: rifle, ammunition, grenades, rope, rations, water, medical supplies, demolition charges. They would need every ounce of it if they made it to the top. That 60 pounds would feel like 200 halfway up a cliff. The plan called for 3 companies. Companies D, E, and F. Company D would assault the cliffs directly. Company E would flank from the right. Company F would scale the western side. Once on top, they would destroy the gun positions and hold against German counterattacks until relieved by forces advancing from Omaha Beach. Simple plan, brutal execution. H-hour was 6:30. The Rangers were supposed to land at the base of the cliffs, fire their grappling hooks, and begin climbing immediately. Speed was critical. The longer they stayed at the bottom, the more time Germans had to prepare. The more time to bring up reinforcements, the more time to turn the cliff base into a killing zone. But the ocean had other plans. Rough seas delayed the landing craft. Strong currents pushed them off course. When the lead boats finally approached Pointe du Hoc, they were 40 minutes late and in the wrong position. Those 40 minutes would cost lives. German defenders who had been surprised by the pre-dawn bombardment now had time to recover and man their positions. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder stood in the lead landing craft watching his men prepare. Some checked weapons, some adjusted gear, some vomited from seasickness, a few prayed, most were silent, lost in thoughts about what would happen in the next few minutes. Rudder knew the statistics, knew the odds, knew that many of these men would not survive the day. He climbed anyway. The landing craft hit the beach at 7:10. Ramps dropped. Rangers poured out into waist-deep water. Machine gun fire immediately opened up from the cliff top. Bullets hit the water like rain. Men stumbled, fell, kept moving. Private First Class Harry Fate, 19 years old from Minnesota, was in the first wave. He later described hitting the beach as running into a wall of sound, the roar of naval gunfire offshore, the crack of German machine guns, the whistle of bullets passing close, the shouts of Rangers calling to each other, and underneath it all, the crash of waves against rock. Fate made it to the cliff base and pressed himself against the rock face. For a moment, he was relatively safe. The overhang meant Germans could not shoot straight down. But he could not stay there. The mission was up, not horizontal. The first grappling hooks fired. Rocket-propelled ropes shot upward, trailing lines behind them. Some caught on the cliff edge, some fell back. Some had their ropes cut by Germans leaning over the top with knives. Rangers grabbed whatever ropes held and started climbing. This is where training met reality. Climbing a cliff while carrying 60 pounds of gear. Climbing while exhausted from seasickness and adrenaline. Climbing while men above you shoot down. Climbing while grenades explode nearby, showering you with rock fragments. Climbing while your best friend falls past you, silent except for the impact at the bottom. Sergeant Leonard Lomel from Company D grabbed a rope and started up, hand over hand, feet scrambling for purchase on wet rock. His rifle slung across his back kept catching on outcrops. His helmet blocked his upward vision. He climbed by feel and faith. Halfway up, a German potato masher grenade landed on the narrow ledge beside him. Lomel had maybe 2 seconds. He could not climb faster, could not dodge. He grabbed the grenade and threw it outward as hard as possible. It exploded in mid-air, far enough away that the shrapnel missed him. He kept climbing. At the top, Germans were fighting desperately. They knew what those cliffs meant. If Americans gained the high ground, the entire defensive position collapsed. They fired, threw grenades, cut ropes, pushed down rocks. Anything to stop the Rangers from reaching the summit. But the Rangers kept coming. For every rope cut, another was fired. For every man who fell, another grabbed the same rope and climbed. There was no retreat. No plan B, only up. First Sergeant Leonard Lomel pulled himself over the cliff edge at 7:35. He was the first Ranger to reach the top. He expected immediate gunfire. Instead, the landscape was chaos. The pre-invasion bombardment had torn the ground apart. Craters overlapped craters. Concrete bunkers stood damaged but not destroyed. Trenches zigzagged everywhere. And Germans were pulling back to secondary positions, shocked that anyone had actually made it up those cliffs. Lomel did not wait for orders. He began moving toward the nearest gun position, rifle ready. Other Rangers pulled themselves up and followed. They moved in small groups, using craters for cover, advancing from position to position. Corporal William Bill Cruz from Company E reached the top moments later. He expected to see the massive 155mm guns immediately. Instead, he saw empty bunkers. The massive concrete casemates that were supposed to house the guns were there, but the guns were not. This should have been good news. No guns meant no threat to the beaches, but it raised terrifying questions. Where were the guns? Had they been moved? Were they still operational? Could they still hit the invasion fleet? The mission had just become more complicated. The Rangers had climbed cliffs under fire to destroy guns that were not there. Now they had to find those guns while Germans counterattacked from all directions. By 8 o'clock, approximately 90 Rangers had made it to the top. More than half the assault force was dead, wounded, or still pinned at the cliff base. Those 90 men now faced the German defenders who had been waiting in prepared positions beyond the bombardment zone. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder established a command post in a bomb crater near the cliff edge. He could see the English Channel behind him, still full of invasion ships. He could see the torn landscape ahead where his men were spreading out to search for the guns. He could see German infantry beginning to organize for counterattack, and he could see the bodies of Rangers who had not made the climb. Rudder knew his position was precarious. He held a small piece of ground, surrounded by enemies. His men were scattered. Casualties were mounting. Communications with the beach were spotty. The follow-up Ranger battalions that were supposed to reinforce Pointe du Hoc had been diverted to Omaha Beach when the Rangers' delay suggested the mission had failed. He was isolated, outnumbered, and running low on ammunition. And somewhere out there, 6.155mm guns could still threaten the entire invasion. Sergeant Lomel took a squad and began searching the inland area. They moved carefully through the torn landscape, expecting ambush at every crater. The German trenches formed a maze. Some led to bunkers, some led nowhere. Some contained dead defenders. Some contained very alive defenders who opened fire at close range. At 9 o'clock, Lomel and Sergeant Jack Kuhn found a sunken road about 200 yards inland from the cliff edge. And there, camouflaged under netting, were 5 of the 6 missing 155mm guns. They were positioned to fire on Utah Beach. Ammunition was stacked nearby. The guns were fully operational, just not yet manned. This was the target. This was what the mission was about. Not empty bunkers on the cliff. These guns, hidden and ready to massacre troops on the beach below. Lomel had thermite grenades. Kuhn had a satchel of TNs. They moved quickly. Thermite grenades dropped into the guns' traversing mechanisms. TNT charges placed on the recoil systems. No time for careful demolition work. Just destroy them fast and get out before German crews returned. The charges detonated in sequence. Metal screamed as it warped and melted. Recoil mechanisms shattered. Barrels drooped. Within 10 minutes, 5 of the 6 guns were permanently disabled. The 6th gun was found destroyed by naval bombardment in a separate position. The Rangers had accomplished their primary mission. The guns would never fire on the beaches. But the cost of that success was still being counted in blood. Back at the cliff top, German counterattacks intensified. They came in waves, first probing attacks to test Ranger positions, then coordinated assaults from multiple directions. The Germans had numbers. They had prepared positions. They had supplies. The Rangers had determination, and not much else. Private Harry Fate found himself in a shell crater with 5 other Rangers, holding off German infantry advancing across open ground. They had maybe 100 rounds of ammunition left between them. Number grenades, no mortar support, just rifles and the cliff at their backs. The Germans came in rushes. 10 men would advance while others provided covering fire. Rangers shot them down. More would come. Rangers shot them down. It became mechanical. Aim, fire, reload, aim, fire, reload. Do not think about ammunition running out. Do not think about what happens when the Germans realize how few defenders there actually are. Fate's rifle jammed, dirt in the mechanism from being dragged up the cliff. He cleared it with hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. Got it working. Kept firing. At 10:30, the situation was critical. The Rangers held a perimeter roughly 200 yards deep from the cliff edge. German forces surrounded them on 3 sides. The 4th side was a 100-foot drop to rocks and ocean. Ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded men lay in shell craters waiting for medics who were already overwhelmed. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder sent desperate radio messages requesting reinforcement and resupply. The response was not encouraging. Omaha Beach was a slaughterhouse. No one could be spared. The Rangers were on their own. So they held, because there was nothing else to do. Because falling back meant surrendering the position. Because the mission was not just to climb the cliffs, but to hold them until relieved. Because Rangers do not quit. The German attacks came in patterns, artillery barrage, then infantry assault, then a lull while they regrouped. The Rangers learned to time their movements, move during the artillery, shoot during the assault, rest during the lull. minute-by-minute survival. Corporal Cruz found ammunition on dead Germans and redistributed it to Rangers. He crawled from crater to crater under fire, collecting magazines, grenades, anything useful. At one point, he passed a dead Ranger who had been his bunkmate on the transport ship. Cruz took his ammunition and kept moving. Grief was a luxury for later. Survival was for now. By noon, the Rangers had been in continuous combat for 5 hours. Some men had been awake for 24 hours before that. Exhaustion was becoming as dangerous as German bullets. Men made mistakes, moved too slowly, reacted too late, fell asleep in their fighting positions despite the noise. Medics worked miracles with almost nothing. Corporal Frank Peregri, a company medic, moved constantly between wounded men, using torn uniforms as bandages, morphine syringes scrounged from casualties, and sheer willpower to keep men alive. He treated German wounded the same as American. A medic's oath does not recognize nationalities. At 13 o'clock, a German sniper found an excellent position in a partially collapsed bunker. He had a clear view of multiple Ranger positions. He began systematically shooting anyone who moved. 3 Rangers went down in 10 minutes. The sniper was too well protected for return fire to be effective. Private First Class Gordon Hatch volunteered to eliminate the threat. He crawled across 50 yards of open ground, moving during German artillery impacts when attention was elsewhere. It took him 40 minutes to cover that distance. He reached the bunker, worked his way to a firing position, and killed the sniper with a single shot. Hatch never made it back to Ranger lines. A German machine gunner spotted him during his return crawl. The same courage that got him to the sniper position could not protect him from a sustained burst of machine gun fire at close range. These small acts of heroism and sacrifice played out across the battlefield. No grand charges, no dramatic speeches, just individuals doing what needed to be done, knowing the cost might be their life. The afternoon brought new problems. German artillery had found the Ranger positions. They could not hit men in deep craters directly, but near misses were devastating. Shrapnel from airburst shells, concussion that turned organs to jelly. Psychological impact of constant bombardment. Some men broke. Shell shock, combat fatigue, whatever term you prefer, the result was the same. Men who simply stopped functioning. Sat in craters, unresponsive, eyes vacant. Medics tried to help them but had no treatment for minds that had reached their breaking point. Others kept fighting. Sergeant Lamel organized a squad to raid German ammunition supplies. They crawled through trenches, attacked a supply point, grabbed every grenade and ammunition box they could carry, and crawled back. Lamel was wounded twice during that mission but refused evacuation. By 16 o'clock, the Rangers had been fighting for 9 hours. Ammunition was critically low. Water was almost gone. Food was a distant memory. Medical supplies were exhausted. Approximately 60 Rangers were still combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or too exhausted to fight. German commanders recognized the Ranger weakness and prepared a major assault to overrun the position. They gathered forces from surrounding areas, pulled back their probing attacks, prepared for a coordinated push from multiple directions that would overwhelm the thinning Ranger lines. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder knew the attack was coming. He could see German forces massing, could hear their preparations. He gathered his officers and NCOs for a quick conference. The situation was simple. They could not hold against a major assault with current ammunition and manpower. But they could not retreat, so they would fight until overrun or relieved. No one questioned the decision. They had climbed impossible cliffs, destroyed the guns, held for 9 hours against continuous attacks. If this was where it ended, at least they had accomplished the mission. At 17:30, the German assault began. Artillery pounded Ranger positions for 15 minutes. Then infantry advanced from 3 directions simultaneously. This was not a probing attack. This was annihilation. Rangers fired with everything they had left: rifles, captured German weapons, pistols, anything that shot. They threw rocks when grenades ran out. They fought hand-to-hand when Germans reached the craters. Private Fate found himself face-to-face with a German soldier in his shell hole. Both had empty weapons. They grappled in the mud and blood at the bottom of the crater. Fate was younger but exhausted. The German was fresh. They rolled, punched, fought with a brutality born of desperation. Fate managed to get his hands on a discarded entrenching tool and used it with savage efficiency. The German stopped moving. Fate collapsed next to him, too exhausted to feel triumph or horror. The assault wave hit, broke through in 2 places. German infantry were now inside the Ranger perimeter. Fighting became confused. Friend and enemy mixed in the smoke and chaos. Men shot at movement and hoped they were shooting the right targets. This was the moment the mission would succeed or fail. Not on the cliffs, not destroying the guns. Here in the mud and craters, with exhausted Rangers making their last stand against overwhelming numbers, and then, impossibly, the German assault faltered. Rangers who should have been overrun were still fighting. Small groups held positions that should have fallen. Isolated soldiers made last stands that bought precious seconds for others to regroup. Corporal Cruz found himself alone in a trench system facing 6 German soldiers advancing toward him. He had 8 rounds left in his rifle. He fired carefully, slowly, made every shot count, dropped 4 Germans before the others retreated. Later, he could not explain why they retreated. He had no grenades, no support, just a rifle with 4 rounds left. But they retreated, and the line held. Sergeant Lomel, wounded and barely able to stand, organized a counterattack against German infantry who had penetrated the perimeter. He led 7 Rangers in a charge across open ground. They retook the position in brutal close-quarters fighting. Lomel passed out from blood loss immediately after and had to be dragged to cover by Corporal Peregori. By 18 o'clock, the German assault had been repulsed. They had come within meters of overrunning the Ranger position. They had superior numbers and firepower. But they had retreated, leaving their dead in Ranger fighting positions. Why? Exhaustion on both sides. German commanders who underestimated Ranger determination, individual acts of desperate courage that broke attack momentum at critical moments, luck, fate, divine intervention. Take your pick. The Rangers held, but they could not hold much longer. Ammunition was exhausted. Most men were fighting with captured German weapons. Water was gone. Wounded were dying from treatable injuries because there were no supplies to treat them. The next assault would succeed where this one had failed. At 20 o'clock, as the sun began setting over the English Channel, Rangers in the perimeter heard a sound that changed everything. American voices, shouting in English, coming from inland, not from the cliff. Elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment had finally broken through German lines connecting Omaha Beach to Pointe du Hoc. They had fought their own brutal battles all day, taken horrific casualties, but they had reached the Rangers. Relief forces brought ammunition, water, medical supplies, fresh troops. The Rangers were no longer alone. When the final count was made, the numbers told a stark story. Of the 225 Rangers who began the assault, 135 were casualties, dead or wounded. Some bodies were never recovered from the cliff base. Some wounded would die in the following days despite medical care. But they had held. For nearly 14 hours, those Rangers had held one of the most important positions on D-Day. They had destroyed guns that could have devastated the beaches. They had prevented German reinforcements from using the Pointe du Hoc road network. They had accomplished a mission that planners thought was impossible. The cost was measured in more than casualties. Private Fate survived the battle but never recovered from what he experienced that day. He returned to Minnesota after the war, worked a factory job, rarely spoke about Pointe du Hoc. He died in 1987, and his family found a Purple Heart he had never mentioned earning. Sergeant Lomel received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions destroying the guns and leading the defense. He downplayed his role for the rest of his life, insisting he just did his job. He visited Pointe du Hoc once in the 1980s, stood at the cliff edge, and wept for friends who had not come home. Lieutenant Colonel Rutter survived the war, returned to Texas, became a university president. He rarely gave interviews about Pointe du Hoc. When pressed, he would only say his Rangers were the bravest men he ever knew. The German defenders also had their stories. Many were young conscripts from occupied territories, forced into Wehrmacht service. Some fought fiercely for a cause they believed in. Some fought because their officers would shoot them if they did not. Some were terrified teenagers who wanted nothing more than to survive and go home. War does not care about motivations. It kills the true believer and the conscript with equal efficiency. Today, Pointe du Hoc is a memorial site. The bomb craters remain, preserved. The German bunkers still stand, weathered but intact. The cliff face looks exactly as it did on June 6, 1944. Visitors can stand at the top and look down at the beach 100 feet below and try to imagine climbing that while people shot at you. Most cannot. The human mind struggles to comprehend that level of courage or desperation. Plaques list the names of Rangers who died there. 77 killed in action or died of wounds during the Pointe du Hoc mission and subsequent operations. Each name represents a life, a family who received a telegram, a hometown that mourned, a future that never happened. Private First Class Harold Garwood, killed scaling the cliffs. He was 20. He had planned to become a teacher after the war. Sergeant Julius Belcher, killed in the fighting on top. He was 26. His wife was pregnant with their first child. He never met his daughter. Corporal Otto Stevens, killed during the German counterattacks. He was 19. His mother kept his room exactly as he left it until she died 30 years later. These are not statistics. These are people. Multiply them by millions across all sides of the war, and you begin to understand the true cost. The strategic impact of Pointe du Hoc is still debated. Some historians argue the guns, even if operational, could not have significantly changed the D-Day outcome. Others maintain that destroying them was critical to the invasion's success. The truth is probably somewhere between, but the Rangers did not have the luxury of historical debate. They had orders. They had a mission. They executed both at terrible cost. The lessons of Pointe du Hoc extend beyond military tactics. The mission teaches us about human limits and what happens when people push past them. About courage, not as the absence of fear, but as action despite it. About sacrifice, made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Every Ranger who climbed those cliffs that morning knew the odds. They climbed anyway. That is not recklessness. That is commitment to something larger than individual survival. Commitment to mission, to each other, to the belief that some things are worth the ultimate risk. Modern special operations forces study Pointe du Hoc for tactical lessons, vertical assault techniques, small unit leadership, improvisation under fire, holding against overwhelming odds. The battle provides case studies in dozens of military disciplines, but the real lesson is simpler and more profound. When everything goes wrong, when the plan fails, when you are outnumbered and outgunned and the mission seems impossible, individuals can still make the difference. Not superhuman warriors, just humans who refuse to quit. The Rangers who survived Pointe du Hoc rarely called themselves heroes. They reserved that title for the men who did not come back, for the friends who fell on the cliffs or died in the craters or were buried in military cemeteries far from home. That is the warrior's paradox. The ones who live feel they do not deserve the praise. The ones who die cannot hear it. So we remember. We tell their stories. We visit the memorials. We try to ensure their sacrifice meant something. Did the mission succeed? By objective standards, yes, the guns were destroyed. The position was held. The invasion proceeded. But ask the mothers who lost sons. Ask the wives who became widows. Ask the children who grew up without fathers. Ask them if the mission was worth the cost. Their answer might be different. This is the terrible arithmetic of war. Strategic success measured against individual tragedy. Necessary missions that destroy families. Victories that feel like defeats when you count the bodies. There is no easy conclusion here. No tidy moral lesson. The Rangers climbed. They fought. They died. They won. And the world moved on, mostly forgetting the price paid on that cliff in June 1944. But we remember now. We remember Private Fate in his crater, fighting hand to hand because there was no other option. We remember Sergeant Lommel destroying the guns while under fire. We remember Corporal Cruz crawling between positions, gathering ammunition from the dead. We remember Lieutenant Colonel Rudder standing in his command crater, refusing to abandon his men even when the situation was hopeless. We remember 225 Rangers who attempted the impossible, and the 90 who survived to tell about it, and the 135 who paid the ultimate price so others could live. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc stand unchanged. The waves still crash against the rocks below. The wind still howls across the cratered landscape. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echoes of men climbing, fighting, dying for a cause larger than themselves. That is the legacy of Pointe du Hoc. Not that impossible missions can succeed, but that ordinary people, when called upon, can achieve extraordinary things at extraordinary cost. The Rangers climbed because someone had to. They held because giving up was not an option. They died because war is brutal and unforgiving. They are remembered because their sacrifice deserves nothing less. 100-foot cliffs, machine gun fire from above. 225 Rangers started climbing. Only 90 walked away. But those guns never fired on the beaches, and the invasion succeeded. And the war eventually ended, and freedom, purchased with blood on a French cliff, endured. That is the story of Pointe du Hoc. Not glorious, not clean, just true. The aftermath of Pointe du Hoc extended far beyond June 6, 1944. The Rangers who survived faced weeks of continuous combat as the Normandy campaign ground forward. They were not given time to recover. There was no rotation to safe rear areas, no counseling for trauma. They moved from Pointe du Hoc to the hedgerows of Normandy, fighting in a completely different type of warfare. The bocage country of Normandy was ancient farmland, divided by thick hedgerows, earthen banks topped with dense vegetation. Each field became a separate battlefield. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles. The open cliff tops of Pointe du Hoc had been terrifying, but at least you could see the enemy coming. In the hedgerows, death came from anywhere. Private Fate found himself fighting in this nightmare landscape just days after Pointe du Hoc. His hands still bore scars from climbing the ropes. His ears still rang from the artillery. But the army needed every combat-effective soldier, and Fate was still on his feet, so he fought. The hedgerow fighting was methodical and brutal. Clear one field, move to the next. Clear it, move again. German defenders knew the terrain intimately. They had prepared positions. They had interlocking fields of fire. They made the Americans pay for every field, every hedgerow, every farmhouse. Sergeant Lommel, still recovering from wounds sustained at Pointe du Hoc, led his squad through this grinding warfare. The tactics that worked on the cliffs meant nothing here. Vertical assault skills were useless. Rope climbing techniques were irrelevant. This was infantry combat reduced to its most basic and deadly form. Small unit actions, close-range firefights, grenades and automatic weapons at distances measured in feet. By June 15th, the 2nd Ranger Battalion had been in continuous combat for 9 days. Normal doctrine called for units to be rotated out after 4-8-7-2 hours of sustained action, but there were no replacement units available. The Rangers fought on. The physical toll was obvious. Men lost weight rapidly. Combat rations, when available, provided calories but not enough for the energy expenditure of constant movement and fighting. Sleep deprivation became normalized. Rangers learned to sleep standing up, leaning against walls even during brief pauses in combat. Some men fell asleep while walking, their bodies moving on autopilot while their minds shut down. The psychological toll was less visible but equally damaging. Shell shock, combat fatigue, what we now call PTSD but had no proper name for then. Men developed tremors, became hypervigilant, could not distinguish between present and past, between Normandy and memory. Corporal Cruz noticed his hands shaking uncontrollably whenever there was a lull in fighting. During combat he was fine, calm, focused, but the moment things got quiet, his body betrayed him. His hands would shake so badly he could not light a cigarette or hold a canteen steady. Other Rangers had similar symptoms. Nobody talked about it. You just dealt with it and kept moving. The German defenders they faced in the hedgerows were different from those at Pointe du Hoc. Many were veterans from the Eastern Front, hardened by years of warfare against the Soviets. They knew how to fight, knew how to make terrain work for them, knew how to inflict maximum casualties while conserving their own strength. One German machine gun team, positioned in a hedgerow with perfect fields of fire, held up an entire Ranger company for 6 hours on June 18th. They were dug in, camouflaged, and disciplined. Every time Rangers tried to advance, the machine gun would open up with precise, deadly fire. Artillery could not reach them. Flanking maneuvers were blocked by impassable terrain. Finally, Private First Class Leo Kersey volunteered to crawl forward and eliminate the position. He moved at a rate of about 10 yards per hour, using every fold in the ground, every shadow, every moment of distraction. It took him 4 hours to cover 150 yards. He reached the German position, threw grenades and silenced the machine gun. He never made it back. German infantry, alerted by the grenades, killed him during his withdrawal. The company advanced. They found the German position and discovered it had been manned by 3 soldiers. 3 men had held up an entire company of Rangers for 6 hours. 2 were dead from Kersey's grenades. The 3rd had fled when his partners were killed. This was the mathematics of hedgerow warfare. Small numbers of determined defenders could delay much larger attacking forces indefinitely if positioned correctly and willing to fight to the death. By late June, the 2nd Ranger Battalion had been reduced to roughly 40% of its original strength. The replacements who arrived to fill gaps had no Ranger training, no combat experience, no connection to the men who had climbed the cliffs. They tried their best, but there was a visible difference between Rangers who had been at Pointe du Hoc and those who had not. The veterans could communicate without words. They moved together instinctively. They knew each other's capabilities and limits. The new men disrupted that flow. They had to be trained while in combat, a process that got some of them killed and endangered the veterans trying to teach them. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, promoted to full colonel, struggled with command decisions that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. He sent exhausted men into combat because there was no one else. He ordered attacks he knew would result in casualties because the mission required it. He wrote letters to families of dead Rangers, trying to find words that would provide comfort when no words were adequate. One letter, to the mother of Private Harold Garwood, who had been killed scaling the cliffs, read simply, "Your son was the bravest man I ever knew. He died doing his duty. I wish I could tell you more, but words fail me. He will not be forgotten." Rudder wrote dozens of similar letters. Each one tore at him. Each one felt inadequate. The Rangers fought through June into July. They participated in the capture of Cherbourg. They cleared German positions that had been fortified for years. They took casualties every single day. Not the dramatic mass casualties of Pointe du Hoc, but the steady attrition that destroys units over time. 1 man killed here, 2 wounded there, day after day after day. By August 1, 1944, less than 60 days after D-Day, the 2nd Ranger Battalion was combat ineffective. They had taken over 200% casualties when you counted replacements. The unit that had climbed the cliffs essentially no longer existed, Most of the original Rangers were dead, wounded, or evacuated for medical or psychological reasons. The battalion was pulled back to England to reconstitute. New Rangers were recruited and trained. The unit would see combat again in the Battle of Hurtgen Forest and the Battle of the Bulge, but it was a different unit with a different character. The men who had been at Pointe du Hoc were largely gone. Private Fate was evacuated in late July with what doctors called combat exhaustion. He had been in continuous combat for 7 weeks. He had lost 35 pounds. He shook constantly. He could not sleep without nightmares. The army sent him to a rest facility in England where he spent 3 weeks staring at walls, unable to process what he had experienced. He was offered a discharge. Medical. Honorable. He could go home. He refused. His friends were still fighting. His battalion, what remained of it, was still in combat. He felt he owed them his presence. So he returned to duty in September, rejoining a battalion that barely resembled the one he had left. Sergeant Lommel stayed with the Rangers throughout the war. He was wounded 3 more times after Pointe du Hoc. Each time he refused evacuation beyond immediate medical treatment. He felt responsible for the men in his squad, even though most of the original squad members were dead or wounded by late 1944. In December, during the Battle of the Bulge, Lommel found himself in another desperate situation, surrounded by German forces in the Belgian town of Bergstein, low on ammunition, freezing temperatures. The scenario was grimly familiar. Hold against overwhelming odds, wait for relief, try not to die. He survived. Again, and felt guilty about it. Survivor's guilt is a documented phenomenon now. Then, it was just a weight that veterans carried silently. Why did I live when better men died? What makes me special? Why them and not me? Questions without answers. Burdens carried alone. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The surviving Rangers returned home to a country that had moved on. The parades and celebrations were for the general victory, not specific battles. Pointe du Hoc was a footnote in news coverage. Most Americans had never heard of it. The Rangers did not talk much about their experiences, not because of classified information or military restrictions, but because how do you explain climbing a cliff under fire to someone who has never been shot at? How do you convey the terror and exhaustion and desperate courage to someone whose biggest wartime hardship was rationing? You do not. You just move on. Get a job. Start a family. Try to forget the things that will not let you sleep at night. Private Fate returned to Minnesota and worked in a factory for 40 years. He married, had children, never spoke about the war except in the vaguest terms. His wife once found him crying in the garage at 3 a.m., holding his old Ranger insignia. He would not explain why, just said he was thinking about friends. She did not push. You did not push veterans about their experiences. Sergeant Lommel became a lawyer, practiced in New Jersey, lived a quiet, successful life. He attended Ranger reunions and stayed in contact with survivors. Every year, the group got smaller. Every reunion, more chairs were empty. By the 1990s, only a handful of Pointe du Hoc Rangers remained alive. The 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994 brought renewed attention to Pointe du Hoc. President Ronald Reagan had given a famous speech at the site in 1984, honoring the boys of Pointe du Hoc. That speech brought the battle back into public consciousness. Books were written, documentaries were filmed. The surviving Rangers, now in their 70s, finally began telling their stories. Lommel gave interviews, appeared in documentaries, spoke at schools. He was eloquent and thoughtful, always deflecting praise to those who had not returned. He described the mission in tactical terms, but his voice would break when talking about specific men, about friends who fell during the climb, about soldiers who held positions until overrun, about the cost that no strategic analysis could capture. In one interview, Lommel was asked if the mission was worth it, if destroying those guns justified the casualties. He thought for a long time before answering. The guns were real. The threat was real. Someone had to deal with it. We volunteered. We succeeded. That is all I know how to measure." Then he added, quieter, "But I would trade every medal, every bit of recognition, every historical footnote to have just one of those men back. Just one." Private Fate died in 1987 without ever returning to Pointe du Hoc. His family asked if he wanted to visit, especially as the 40th anniversary approached in 1984. He declined, said some memories were better left in the past. His daughter later said she regretted not pushing him, not learning more about his experiences while he was alive, but that was not how things were done. Veterans kept their pain private. The last survivor of the Pointe du Hoc assault, Sergeant Len Lomel, died in 2011 at age 91. His funeral was attended by active duty Rangers, military officials, and a few aging veterans from other D-Day units. The 2nd Ranger Battalion sent a delegation. Lomel was buried with full military honors. At his funeral, one of his sons read from a letter Lomel had written, but never sent to the mother of a ranger killed at Pointe du Hoc. The letter had been found in his papers after his death. It read, "Your son died doing something most men could never imagine attempting. He climbed into hell because his country asked him to. He did not hesitate, did not complain, just did his duty with a courage I still cannot comprehend. I was there. I saw what he did, and I want you to know that his sacrifice was not wasted. The mission succeeded because of men like him. But success is a poor consolation for a mother who lost her son. I am sorry. We are all sorry. We remember him. We will always remember." The letter was dated 1947. Lomel had carried it for 64 years, unable to send it, unable to throw it away. Today, Pointe du Hoc remains one of the best preserved D-Day sites. The French government maintains it as a memorial. The bomb craters have been stabilized but not filled. The German bunkers stand as they did in 1944, though cleaned of weapons and fortifications. Visitors can walk the battlefield, stand at the cliff edge, look down at the beach where Rangers landed. The site receives about 400,000 visitors per year. Most are American tourists following the D-Day Trail along the Normandy coast. They spend 4 or 5 minutes at Pointe du Hoc, take photos, read the plaques, try to imagine what happened there. Some visitors are moved to tears. Some stand silently, processing emotions they cannot name. Some leave small American flags at the memorial. Some leave flowers. Some leave notes thanking Rangers they never knew for sacrifices they cannot fully understand. School groups visit and teachers try to convey the significance. But how do you explain this to 15-year-olds who have never experienced real danger, who live in a world where the largest threat might be a difficult test or social media drama? The gap between their experience and what happened on those cliffs is almost unbridgeable, yet some students are affected deeply. They stand at the cliff edge, and something clicks. The realization that people their age or barely older climbed this while being shot at, that men died on these rocks. That history is not abstract, but built on individual actions and sacrifices. One teacher reported a student who stood at the cliff edge for 20 minutes, silent, tears running down his face. When asked what was wrong, the student said, "They were just kids, like us." Just kids. The teacher had no response because the student was absolutely correct. Military units still visit Pointe du Hoc as part of professional development. Current Rangers study the tactical decisions. What went right? What went wrong? What lessons apply to modern special operations? The mission has been analyzed in countless military papers and studies, but the academic analysis misses something essential. It misses the human element that made the mission possible, the bonds between men that kept them climbing when every instinct screamed to stop. The trust in leadership that made suicidal orders followable, the commitment to mission that overrode self-preservation. You cannot teach that in a classroom. You cannot create it through policy. It emerges from shared hardship, mutual trust, and a culture that values sacrifice over survival. The Rangers who climbed those cliffs created that culture. They did not plan to, did not set out to become examples. They just did their jobs under impossible circumstances and became legends in the process. But legends are dangerous. They sanitize reality. They turn complex humans into simple heroes. They make the terrible seem glorious. The Rangers themselves resisted this. They knew what the mission really cost, knew that heroism and horror were inseparable on those cliffs. In his final interview before his death, Sergeant Lomel was asked what he wanted people to remember about Pointe du Hoc. He thought carefully, then said, "Remember that we were just soldiers doing a job. Remember that the job was terrible and necessary. Remember the men who did not come back. Remember that freedom is not free, and someone always pays the bill. And remember to question leaders who talk about war like it is glorious, or easy, or anything other than the last resort of desperate men. Pass. That is the real lesson of Pointe du Hoc, not that impossible missions can succeed through courage and determination, though that is true, but that such missions exact a price that echoes through decades, that success does not erase loss, that we honor the dead not by glorifying their sacrifice, but by understanding its full cost. The cliffs still stand. The memorial still welcomes visitors. The names of the fallen are still carved in stone. And somewhere in the rock face, tiny marks remain where grappling hooks scraped stone on June 6, 1944. Those marks are fading now. Weather and time erode everything. In another 80 years, they may be gone completely. The physical evidence of the climb will disappear. The bunkers will crumble despite preservation efforts. Even the craters will eventually fill in. But the story remains, as long as people remember. As long as we tell the tale of 225 Rangers who attempted the impossible because someone had to. As long as we honor the 135 who paid the ultimate price and the 90 who carried that burden for the rest of their lives. This is why we remember Pointe du Hoc, not to glorify war, not to make young men eager to fight, but to acknowledge that sometimes in the darkest moments of history, ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things, and they do them at terrible cost. Because the alternative is worse. The Rangers climbed because the guns had to be silenced. They held because the mission had to succeed. They died because war is brutal and unforgiving. They are remembered because their sacrifice deserves nothing less than eternal gratitude from those who inherited the freedom they fought to preserve. 100. Footcliffs. Machine gun fire from above. 225 Rangers started climbing. Only 90 walked away. But the mission succeeded. The guns were destroyed. The invasion continued. And the world changed because of what happened on those cliffs on June 6, 1944. That is the story of Pointe du Hoc. Complete. Unvarnished. True.